Considering fantasy cuisine is likely not going to be the first thing that you think about when building your world, but it sure is fun. Food is an important part of any culture or lifestyle, so taking cuisines into consideration for your world will just help make it that much more believable. Hi everyone, welcome back or welcome to my channel for the first time. My name's Jamie. I'm an artist, storyteller, and world builder, and I have a very playful and whimsical fantasy world called Hexium. If you're a returning viewer, then you'll probably notice that my setting's a little bit different. I finally have a studio space, and before I was just recording on a decorated wall in my bedroom, and yeah, I'm really excited about it to just have a definitive space to make my art. But anyway, today I wanted to share how I came up with some of the staple cuisines and fantasy foods for my world from both an artist and a storyteller perspective. So like I said at the start, it's definitely not going to be your starting point if you're just starting to build up your fantasy world. To effectively consider your cuisines, you'll have to flesh out your cultures to some degree first, because there's a lot of things you kind of have to take into consideration when you're building them. So the first thing I would really recommend considering is choosing a direction that you want to take. There's a lot of different approaches you can take, but the main ones that I see are you can either concoct your dishes from scratch and come up with the recipes and the ingredients that you use yourself, or you can put a twist on dishes that we already know. In Hexium, I try to add a decent amount of humor and playfulness to my world, and for my foods to come across this way, I thought it needed that little bit of familiarity, for the humor to land. So I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that now. These are one of my dishes called spring scrolls. You unwrap it before you eat it for a little piece of wisdom, and it's kind of like if a fortune cookie and a spring roll were one. And then these are potion soup dumplings, which are little dumplings I made to look like potion bottles, and each one you eat gives a different effect that enhances your meal. But yeah, that's just two examples of my approach to creating cuisine. I love a good play on words and not taking it too seriously. One of my favorite pieces of media with really creative foods is Delicious in Dungeon. It got an anime recently. It's super popular, so you might have heard of it, but it was actually one of the original inspirations when I was creating all of my dishes for Hexium. If you're unfamiliar, it's a show where the main characters cook and eat monsters, so you end up getting some really creative dishes. For example, there is Kelpie grilled meat and exorcism sorbet. Also, if you really enjoy the culinary aspect of world building and just find this part of it fun, then you might want to even come up with your own dishes from scratch. I think this can be really cool and unique as well, but I definitely recommend keeping some connection to dishes that we already know, just so it doesn't feel too foreign to people. But yeah, I talk about this a lot in my world building videos. Is just world building is never ending. You can truly go as long as you want with it, and it will never end, and you can get lost in the little details forever. So you kind of have to pick and choose which aspects you want to go into more detail about than others. And I always recommend just going with what you enjoy the most. So yeah, if food and the culinary arts is something you really enjoy diving into, then by all means, just go for it. Either way you go, you're gonna have to consider the terrain and geography of the place that the food is coming from. So let's talk about that for a minute. You could choose to look into cultures that come from similar climates or terrains from your fantasy counterparts and work from there. But I'd also like to say, just because certain crops and ingredients can only grow in a certain region on Earth doesn't mean that that has to correlate with your fantasy world. If you've seen some of my videos, then you know I'm always going to encourage people to jump outside the box and not necessarily follow the rules of Earth. But yeah, for more on that, I'd recommend checking out my fantasy map making video. I won't repeat myself too much here. The ingredients available to your cultures is pretty much up to you. I just think the most important part is that, one world might have several cultures, and it's important to differentiate and think about the themes in their food so that when you see a dish from that culture, you can tell it's from that culture and not another one in your world. They need to differentiate each other. For example, I have 4 different nations in my world with 4 different distinct cultures. And I never really draw inspiration from one specific real world culture, because I don't want mine to just feel like the fantasy counterpart of an already existing culture. I'm saying culture a lot, sorry. However, that consistency aspect is still important. And yeah, let me give some examples because I don't know if I'm making too much sense. I basically just chose an overarching theme of the dishes for my cultures. So Utramal is a series of tropical islands in my world. Their cuisine is just emphasized by bright and playful colors and a heavy emphasis on seafood. Djorsum is a harsh mountain climate. It has a lot of homely comfort dishes, and is quite meat heavy. Then Benefica has a lot of biodiversity and greenery, so I tried to reflect that in their dishes by making it very vegetable heavy and healthy. And once again, you don't have to follow the rules of reality. Like, mountain cities don't have to just be meat and potatoes. And you've probably noticed mine aren't even that creative on this. Like, my tropical islands are seafood based and my mountain cities are very heavily meat based. But I kind of chose to put my creativity in like the dishes themselves rather than the themes of the dishes, if that makes sense. But yeah, there is a ton of different fantasy factors that could affect how your cultures receive their foods. Maybe there's different magic systems that affect the farming, and certain crops can grow in places that they wouldn't usually be able to. It's your fantasy world, so you get to make all the rules. I guess my overall advice this section is to just make sure there is a certain amount of consistency and overarching theme to your fantasy cultures. So moving on to the next section, I wanted to talk about how your food is served. This is something not a lot of people consider, but it can actually add so much storytelling to your cuisines. I think it's especially important if you're drawing your dishes because you're going to want to see how they're visually presented. But even if you're just writing about it, it will help you know how your characters are going to interact with and actually eat the dish. And I kept incorporating those previous themes into like the dishes that they were served on here as well. And once again, I think that just helps make it instantly recognizable. You see this dish and you know it's from this nation. So foods from Dorsum, the harsh mountain continent, are usually served on plates with blue and gold and triangular patterns. The plates from Utramal are very sea themed. I tried to incorporate things from the ocean and like shells and things like that onto their plates. And then Benefica's dishes are very naturey and have natural patterns and designs on them. I realized I said I had 4 nations at the beginning. One of them is heavily neglected, but I'm actually finally working on that one now. But yeah, these aren't like insanely complex or anything. I think if you are creating your own dishes from scratch, then there's definitely a lot more room to just go crazy with how your dishes are served and come up with some pretty cool and creative presentations for that. But yeah, it doesn't have to be anything too complex. But I think this is a really great culture exercise in general, because you kind of have to think about your nation as a whole. This is when I really started to think about what each nation represents and how I wanted to differentiate them from each other. The next part is the ingredients themselves, meat and vegetables. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video, there's a few aspects of world building that you kind of have to consider before reaching the part of fantasy cuisines. And to do that, you need to think about the flora and fauna that live in your world. You will likely have meat-based dishes unless your world is full of vegetarians, and for that, you'll have to consider the animals that live in your world for the meat to come from. But yeah, I definitely started with my creatures first, and this was the baseline for a lot of Hexium's foods. The moss bison is a creature that I created in my world. Bison are my favorite animal ever. I wanted to create a fantasy equivalent to that. And really tragically, I started thinking about how we eat bison burgers. So that became the moss bison burger, and it just has like a slab of moss on top of it instead of lettuce. Another creature in Hexium is called a wave ray, which is based on stingrays, and it basically happens when a wave in Hexium or part of the ocean has enough magical energy that it will just gain consciousness and a new creature is born. And I always thought stingrays looked a little bit like pancakes, so that's what I did. Wave-ray pancakes. And then there's also tarantula truffles. I have a spider in my world called Choco Ranchula that's made entirely out of cocoa. And the little butt is the truffle part. I really, really just recommend embracing your childlike wonder here. Like, all of these things are just things I kind of thought of in my childhood. And it's super simple, but you kind of have to tap into that version of yourself to think of these things. I think it just adds a little dash of humor and playfulness into your world. And if you're not going for that, then you don't have to do this by any means. This is just my personal approach. And I guess even if you don't go too heavy on the meat dishes in the world, you'll be doing the same thing just with the plants that you're working with. So you'll kind of have to consider these things either way. So this is the last exercise that really, really helped me bring my fantasy cuisines to another level. I talked about this briefly in my last video where I shared some of my favorite world building exercises, so I do apologize if this is a little repetitive for my followers. So once you do have a set amount of dishes, I really, really recommend making a menu from your world. This doesn't have to be like aesthetic or polished, but it helps you take so much into consideration about your foods. The first thing that it will require you to do is write a couple of sentences about your dish that helps describe it and make sure that it's fully fleshed out to a point that people can understand what it is. It can also bring balance to the dishes you're making. When I first created mine, I made a drink, main, and dessert menu. And maybe just set a goal to make 3 of each, so a total of 9 dishes from each culture. And then it will also make you consider the price of these dishes, so you'll kind of have an idea in your head of what is considered a delicacy or what ingredients are harder to get. And then if you are an artist, you can actually draw these dishes and include that in the menu as well. I know Gordon Ramsay says don't trust a restaurant with photos in their menu, but it doesn't matter here. But the best part too is even if you're not an artist, a majority of menus don't have photos of their dishes anyways, so you can just write a description of them. But yeah, it's just a really fun and interactive exercise. I'm always going to advocate for making things that actually feel like they've just been pulled out of your world. Maybe these menus actually turn into different restaurants or taverns that your characters visit. Maybe it makes you start thinking about the more mundane roles or jobs in your world. Do the chefs operate differently than they do on Earth? Is magic involved in the culinary aspect? And yeah, I guess this part for me is just quite low stress, so it's something I choose to go into a bit more detail about than other things. So if you're not that into the cuisines of your world, do not feel like you have to go this in depth by any means. Maybe your characters are just visiting a tavern and you just are trying to think of a few creative dishes for them to eat and then get on with the story. And that is perfectly fine too. Like I said, it's important to find balance, so if you don't care for this aspect, do not put all this time and energy into it and focus on something that you enjoy more. But yeah, I hope you found some points from this video inspiring. I always think it's super helpful to see what other people have done and looking at other people's fantasy worlds, so I always kind of try to include my own examples alongside the points I'm trying to make. Please feel free to share your own fantasy dishes down below. I would absolutely love to read about them. And if you do think of any points that I didn't make, please, please, please comment. I love reading the comments, and sometimes I've found myself inspired by you guys, which is really amazing. And I also wanted to say thank you for 400 followers. I hit it the other day, and I've been on this 2-month break, and it's amazing that my account has still been growing while I haven't been posting. And yeah, just a little future channel update. I've got tons of videos ideas in my head. I've still been planning them out so that when I came back, I wouldn't have a video drought. I might have mentioned earlier, I've got one nation in my world that I've been neglecting, so I wanted to try a new video soon where I actually build up that nation and create the art alongside making that video. And it will be something titled like Make a Fantasy Nation with Me. So that I can actually explain my process as I'm doing it, because a lot of the things I've made is like from 2 years ago. And yeah, I need to stop neglecting Mount Yggdrasil. And I also wanted to do a few videos where I talk about world building on a broader sense. I know one of the ones I have planned is like things I wish I did differently when I first started out, because I kind of tried to drop in tidbits of advice as I'm explaining specific concepts. Like this one was about cuisine, but I think I have a lot to say about just world building in a general sense as well. So yeah, those are 2 new different categories of videos I guess I'm considering in the future. But yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing you again real soon.